Hey there, guys. It's Mr. Boganagada here. So we are going to get started with lesson 4.2 here in period 4. And I know that a lot of you have been asking, or several of you have been asking, for more in the way of lectures. So I want to try to find a way to give that to you, those of you that want more of the lecture, while still preserving some of the time that we have in class to do some skill work, maybe incorporate some of the reading that you guys have to do. So this is what I've come up with so far. We'll see how it works and we'll go from there. But remember, we are here in period 4. This is the period between 1800 and 1848. So that is where we're going to start. And let's take a look at what this topic will be. So this topic is going to be all about political parties during the age of Jefferson. So we're going to look at both the Federalists, what becomes of the Federalists, what happens to the Federalists, and the Democratic Republicans, which eventually work their way to being just called the Republicans. So for now, we're going to keep calling them the Democratic Republicans. But if you ever hear me talk about just the Republicans in this context, in this period, that's who we're referring to. So they're kind of one and the same at this point. Don't confuse them though, and I want to make this kind of clear. Don't confuse them with the modern day parties, right? We have the Democrats and the Republicans. Don't confuse that with the Democratic Republicans who later become the Republicans. It's a whole different scenario in that case. But let's get started with 4.2 political parties during the age of Jefferson. So, in the election of 1800, you have 5 different candidates for president. You have Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr running as Democratic Republicans, and then you also have John Adams, who is the incumbent president, and Thomas Pinckney, who are running as Federalists. Now, I don't want you to confuse the election of 1800 with modern day elections, right? To take the modern day equivalent, you have Donald Trump and JD Vance. They are running as Republicans for president and vice president. You also have Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. They're running as Democrats for president and vice president. They're running together. Here, these are 5 separate candidates for president. Now, there was a bit of an agreement between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr that Aaron Burr would be vice president, right? There was some sort of agreement worked out. But here in 1800, all 5 men are running for president, and there could have been a chance that Aaron Burr defeated uh, Thomas Jefferson. But there are 5 different candidates for president. Before the 12th Amendment was ratified in 1804, electors vote on each individual candidate. And so there's a chance that we end up with a tie, which is what we'll talk about here. But the candidate with the most votes becomes president. The candidate with the second most votes becomes vice president. So there could have been an opportunity for, say, for example, which had happened previously, a Democratic Republican president and a Federalist vice president, which in the case previous was John Adams was president and Thomas Jefferson was his vice president, and they were from different parties. So this is before the 12th Amendment happens in 1804. So again, let's take a look here at the election of 1800. And again, before we get the 12th Amendment in 1804, each elector, which we've talked about the Electoral College, which people are not in theory voting for the president, they're voting for a set of electors who will represent their state to the Electoral College. And the electors cast votes for different candidates. And before we get the 12th Amendment, which is where we see presidents running with their running mate, their vice president, in 1800, it was still the case that the highest number of votes went to the president and the second highest became vice president. So if you look at the map here and the chart, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr in the Electoral College meets and votes because each elector voted for 2 candidates. Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied. John Adams came in third with 65 votes. Pinckney came in third with 64. Unfortunately, John Jay only gets 1 electoral vote from Rhode Island. But again, here we have a tie between 2 Democratic Republicans, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. So we need to figure out what is going to happen. And in that case, it goes to the House of Representatives to decide. So when we get into the House, right? The election is going to be determined by this lame duck session of the House of Representatives. And when we say lame duck, what we're referring to is essentially the outgoing House of Representatives. We want to recall that here in 1800, the election took place in November, but uh, for whatever reason, right, it's not until the following March that the new president and the new House and the new Senate take office. In some instances, I guess it does take time for them to travel from far away, from Georgia, South Carolina, from Maine. So that most likely was the case. But here it goes to the House, and you have the House of Representatives, who essentially is on its way out, and it is up to them to determine who would become president of the United States. There are two candidates who are tied. So the two candidates, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, go before the House. The House votes on who should be president, and it takes 35 votes over the course of what is a very tense week in the House. And finally, we get to February the 17th, where on the 36th try, the House finally votes in favor of Thomas Jefferson to be president of the United States. So the Democratic Republicans are now in control of things. The incoming House of Representatives has a huge Democratic Republican majority. And this is going to symbolize the first time in American history where there is a peaceful transfer of power from one party to another, right? We are going to see Federalist John Adams kind of give power over to Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson. It hadn't happened before, right? George Washington famously was nonpartisan. He didn't subscribe to any particular political party. Um, John Adams was a Federalist, and then Thomas Jefferson here is the Democratic Republican. So it's the first time we see a switchover in power. Now, the election of 1800 is also sort of the beginning of what becomes known by a couple of different names. One, we call it the Virginia Dynasty because the next three presidents are all from Virginia. So you have Thomas Jefferson, who takes office in 1801. He goes till 1809. James Madison is elected in 1808 and reelected again in 1812. James Madison is elected in 1816 and then is reelected again in 1820. So he serves all the way to 1825. So, one, we refer to this as the Virginia Dynasty because all three presidents are from the state of Virginia. It's also the beginning of what's known as the Jeffersonian Republic because all three men are Democratic Republicans. They all subscribe to these similar political ideas of Thomas Jefferson. Not the same, but similar. So, this is why we also refer to this as the Jeffersonian Republic. Now, we refer to this as the Jeffersonian Republic, and there's a bit of a typo here on the screen, so we'll talk about that in a sec. But from 1800 to 1824, the Democratic Republicans hold a majority of the seats in the House, ranging anywhere from 60 to 85% majorities, right? That is massive. It's something we wouldn't probably see today. But that puts them in control, and this is the typo here. It says all three branches of government. That's a typo on my end. It should say two of the three branches of government. They're in control of the legislative branch with Congress. They're in control. They have majorities in the House and the Senate, and they are also in control of the White House, the executive branch, the presidency, right? With Jefferson, with Monroe and Madison, right? They're all in control there for this 24-year period. It is a huge chunk of American history. The judicial branch is still somewhat controlled by the Federalists, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. So, what is the vision for the Jeffersonian Republic? Right? These three men, the Democratic Republican Party, what is the vision that Thomas Jefferson and these Democratic Republicans want to create? And the ultimate goal for them is to shape America into a society of sturdy, independent farmers who are free from workshops, free from the industrial towns, free from the urban mobs of Europe. Remember, here America is still sort of trying to build itself into a new country. This is only about 25 ish years since the revolution. So you have this idea that we want to avoid being those urban centers of Europe, but we also have some urban centers here in America. We want to get people out of them. We want to create this sturdy, independent farm culture, this agricultural, agrarian culture. That is what the Jeffersonian vision is, right? They celebrate this idea of localism, of Republican simplicity, right? They are champions of distinctive visions for America. And ultimately, and above everything else, they proposed a smaller government, a federal government that has sharply limited power. So here you have Thomas Jefferson, right? He is famous to have said, the government is best which governs the least, right? So the idea is the least amount of government, the smallest government possible, to not be in the way, right? To limit its power, right? And that is the best thing for America. And unfortunately, right, and that's those are ideas that you see throughout history. Famously, Ronald Reagan was one in the 80s, and well, the early mid 80s was famous for saying that the era of big government was over, and that the government should get out of the way, right? Smaller government. So these are ideas we still see today. Um, but this idea is far more difficult to maintain in practice, especially for the ideas that Thomas Jefferson wanted to accomplish. So let's take a look at how that plays out. So in reality, Thomas Jefferson is successful, right? He has this vision that government is a necessary evil, right? And again, that's kind of where he gets this idea that the government that governs the best governs the least, is because it's a necessary evil to have. We need some, but we should only have as much as we need. Does that make sense? So Jeffersonian republicanism calls for a reduction in the power of the federal government, and Thomas Jefferson is pretty successful at that. He reduces the size of the military, reduces the size of the Navy, right? We only need what we need. And he eliminates a number of federal jobs, so to the number of people who work for the federal government. Again, something we see over time again and again, right? He repealed excise taxes, which are indirect taxes on goods, right? So instead of taxing a consumer who purchases an item, you tax the good itself when it's manufactured or made. So you tax the business owner. And then he also was successful in reducing the national debt. So we want to remember again, this is only about 25 years after the revolution. So America still has a bit of a debt to pay. So in his 8 years, he reduces the federal debt, the national debt, from $83 million to $57 million. So again, he's pretty successful at reducing the power of the federal government, reducing the size of the federal government. Unfortunately, though, there was one pretty big expansion to come. And that expansion comes with this: the Louisiana Purchase. 530 million acres of land that are sold to the United States for $15 million from France. So, this is a huge expansion. And what we want to do right now, and one of the things that's important for us to do in APUS history, is to think about the context and then the actual event itself and what the effect of that was. So, let's do that here. So, like many Americans, when we think of the context of why the Louisiana Purchase was so important, Thomas Jefferson understands that America needs to access the mouth of the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans, or they would eventually lose everything beyond the Appalachian Mountains, right? There would be no opportunity for them, for the United States to expand. There would be no opportunity for us to grow. And again, we want to remember during this period is when we start to see the idea of what is called manifest destiny. Manifest destiny is something we'll talk about a little bit later in the chapter. But there's this idea that America needs to continue to expand and to grow. And at this point, Spain had control over the Louisiana territory and had secretly given it back to France. And this immediately puts Jefferson on guard, right? Jefferson is kind of famous for saying there's one spot on the globe, and the possessor of which is our natural and habitual enemy, and that is New Orleans. It was under Spanish control for a long time. And then Spain had secretly given it back to France. And this put Napoleon, who was the greatest military genius of the time, as America's neighbor. So this became a very tense situation. And Thomas Jefferson knew that there was a need to keep access to the port of New Orleans, or they could lose everything to the West. So, with this in mind, Thomas Jefferson sends James Monroe to Paris. James Monroe is the friend of Thomas Jefferson, sends him to Paris, and he gives him instructions to offer Napoleon $10 million for both New Orleans and for Florida. Okay. But this was at the exact time that Napoleon was trying to put down a revolution in Haiti and was running very short on cash, right? He was suppressing the Haitian revolution. His generals and the members of his army were succumbing to this yellow fever in Haiti. He was running short on cash, so he needed the money. So Napoleon is going to be a little bit um, motivated to sell here, and that's going to change the course. So remember, Jefferson originally only wants New Orleans, only wants Florida. Those are the two things he wants, and he's willing to offer $10 million for it. So on April the 10th, 1803, Napoleon offers up not just New Orleans, but all of the Louisiana Territory to the United States for $15 million. And there is a historian at the time called Henry Adams, and he wrote that never did the United States get so much for so little, right? You have 828,000 square miles for just pennies an acre, right? It's super, super cheap. But this goes against everything Thomas Jefferson stands for, right? It's Thomas Jefferson stood for limited government. He stood for a strict construction of the Constitution. Purchasing foreign land is not mentioned anywhere in the Constitution. So Thomas Jefferson is of this idea that does the United States actually have this power to buy land? But even though it goes against everything he stands for, everything he believes in, he knows the importance of having access to New Orleans and having access to the Mississippi River. So he decides to go ahead and take the deal. So he submits the treaty to the United States Senate. There's a majority in the Senate of Democratic Republicans, and they quickly ratify that and approve the Louisiana Purchase. And the result of that is pretty significant. So, the result of the Louisiana Purchase, probably the most significant result of that, is that it doubles the size of the United States. Secondly, it removes this pretty big European power from the border of the United States, right? It gets rid of France from Louisiana. And so getting rid of them is going to be really important for us, but it extends the western frontier far past the Mississippi River all the way out to Oregon. Okay. But politically, it's also very important, right? The West and the South at the time. And again, when we say the West, we're talking about places like Illinois, we're talking about places like Iowa, Ohio. That's the West at this point. The West and the South are pretty solidly Democratic Republican supporting. So the addition of these new Western states, these new Western territories, would start to reduce the power of New England and reduce the power of the Federalists. And the situation became so dire that you have a group of really diehard Federalists who are led by Timothy Pickering, who organized a scheme in 1804 to break away from the United States, break away from the Union, and establish what's called a Northern Confederacy. Right? We're 60 years before the Civil War, and there's again an idea to split from the Union. And this idea, this plot, collapses. And later on would lead to the duel between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton, which resulted in Hamilton's death, right? Which is a pretty famous event in history. But more broadly, it symbolizes a very politically charged atmosphere at the time, right? The Federalists were very very keen to try and maintain some power. So now we're going to kind of fast forward just a little bit and talk more about the Embargo Act. And again, this also highlights more of the political tension between the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. But the Embargo Act is good for no one. So let's dive into this one just a bit. So again, looking back at context, between 1803 and 1807, you have what are called the Napoleonic Wars. And during this period, the British and the French continue a practice of capturing neutral American ships. The United States tried to stay out of this conflict of the Napoleonic Wars, which involved Britain and France. We traded with both, we did business with both, we tried to stay out of it. So, for the 4 year period between 1803 and 1807, the British and the French would capture these ships. About 500 ships were captured by the British, 200 ships were captured by the French. And it is in June of 1807 that the British ship Leopard fired upon the USS Chesapeake. In that attack, 3 Americans were killed, 4 Americans were taken captive and impressed into the British military. So basically, impressment is where an American was captured and then forced to serve in the British military, in the British Navy, right? So that is definitely not something you would see happen very much today, if at all. So, because of this, Americans wanted war, but if we remember, the United States has very little to fight with because Jefferson, since he's been in office since 1801, has been reducing the size of the military, has been reducing the size of the Navy. So there's not a lot of force to fight with, and but the country wants war. So Jefferson has to find a way to stop this practice. How do I end this without having to get into war? So the result of that effort is the Embargo Act of 1807. The law bans all exports. No one is allowed to export any goods to any country anywhere. Specifically, I think the effort was to to keep American ships from going to Europe and particularly Britain and France, but they banned everything. So American ships could not clear a port if they were going to a foreign country. So if you were going from New York to Spain, couldn't do it. If you were going from New York to Virginia, go for it, right? If you were going to a foreign country, not allowed. We could still import things, but very few ships would actually come to America because they couldn't leave with anything. There were no exports allowed from the Americas or from America. Okay. And this is absolutely catastrophic for the United States. Exports fall from 108 million to 22 million, and imports fall from $138 million to $57 million. It's a huge issue, and it is catastrophic for the American economy as a whole. Now, particularly, this impacted New England, which New England traded very heavily with Great Britain um, and with Europe as a whole. But not only did it cause outcry from the Federalists, but now you have all Americans who are so upset with that. Um, and people from across the country, including people in Jefferson's own party, the Democratic Republican Party, who said, this is killing the economy. We cannot do this. So in his final days of his presidency, Thomas Jefferson calls for the law to be repealed, to get rid of it. And so in 1809, Congress replaces it with what is called the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809, which does, I think, what the goal was originally of the Embargo Act, which is to ban trade only with Britain and France. But again, that's particularly going to impact New England, which is a Federalist stronghold. And because New England trades quite significantly with Great Britain. So now we're going to talk about kind of the one balance, the one check on the power that is being exerted by Thomas Jefferson and by the Democratic Republicans who have a majority in the Congress, in the House and the Senate, is the Supreme Court. And the man who is the Chief Justice, and you'll see this as we go throughout the rest of history, we start to refer to periods in the Supreme Court by the person who is in the head chair, the Chief's chair, Chief Justice John Marshall. So, John Marshall's Supreme Court is what we will speak on here, and we'll talk about some of the context of of the Supreme Court decisions that really sort of checked the balance of power. So if we remember back to the 1800, the Democratic Republicans had a sweeping victory, right? Thomas Jefferson becomes president, Aaron Burr becomes vice president. The Democratic Republicans have huge majorities in the House, have a majority in the Senate. The only remaining power for the Federalists is their control over the federal courts. So you have John Marshall, who is Thomas Jefferson's cousin, actually, but is a Federalist. He's appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court by John Adams in the last couple of months that John Adams is president. He would go on to hold that position of Chief Justice for 34 years, which puts him in a very good position. If we remember that the Democratic Republicans had their huge majorities and had their power for just over 25 years. So John Marshall is in a unique position, having served for 34, because remember, appointments to the Supreme Court are lifetime appointments. Um, he's in a position to make decisions on landmark cases. And Thomas Jefferson, if we remember, is in a position or of the idea that there should be limits on the power of government, that the government that governs the best governs the least. John Marshall's a little bit different, right? He has a belief as a Federalist that the central government should be stronger. So his decisions would ultimately go on to strengthen the power of the federal government, which Thomas Jefferson really wasn't a huge fan of. So one of the last big acts of the Federalist Congress, the lame duck Congress in 1801, that not only decided that Thomas Jefferson would be president and Aaron Burr would be vice president, one of the last actions of that Federalist Congress was to pass the Judiciary Act of 1801, a law that created 6 new circuit courts and created 16 new judicial positions. And again, remember, federal judges are appointed for lifetime appointments. So this was an effort to fill all of these positions and all of these courts with members of the Federalist Party. But they were done so last minute, right? They were referred to at the time as quote unquote midnight appointments, right? Because they were so rushed through the Congress. And in the last few hours of John Adams' presidency, a few of those commissions were not delivered to Congress. Thomas Jefferson, when he comes to power and becomes president, orders those commissions to be held back and held up. Why? Well, because he's a Democratic Republican. He doesn't want more Federalists on the federal courts, on the federal bench, because the Federalists have completely opposite political beliefs as he does. So he wants those positions held back. Now, one of those men who had been appointed to the federal court, William Marbury, demanded his commission be delivered to Congress, right? He was appointed by John Adams just because a simple paperwork issue. He should not have his commission delivered and considered before the Congress. So he sued the federal government. He took the government to court, and that case made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And in that case, Marbury versus Madison, and again, we refer to the courts as by the name of the person who is the Chief Justice. So when we say here that Marshall decided, it's really the Marshall Court, right? But Marshall decided that, Marbury should have his commission. It was his right. It was the right thing to do to give William Marbury his commission. But the clause that Marbury was requesting this under, through a law that was passed in 1789, the Judiciary Act of 1789. There was a clause in that law that had to do with it, and that was the claim that Marbury was using. Well, John Marshall said that claim that you're using is actually not constitutional. So therefore, we can't fulfill your request as a Supreme Court, because that law that you're using isn't constitutional. It's a little bit confusing, but ultimately, the reason why this is important is Marbury versus Madison is really the case that establishes the role of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has this power now, which we call judicial review. And the Marshall Court here really establishes that idea that it is the right of the Supreme Court to review the actions of Congress and government to whether they follow the Constitution or not, right? Um, and that's the most important takeaway from Marbury versus Madison, not which clause and who decided what, but Marbury versus Madison is what gives the Supreme Court that role of judicial review. It's something that's in the Constitution, but it is the reading of that Constitution by Chief Justice Marshall that really establishes that precedence. And there are other examples here of John Marshall, Chief Justice Marshall, really establishing powers of the federal government. And in 1810, there's another case called Fletcher v. Peck, which involved land fraud in the state of Georgia. Now, Georgia had tried to pass a law that would invalidate a land contract, and Chief Justice Marshall said that's not something that a state can do. A state cannot pass legislation that would invalidate a contract, a land contract. So it was the first time that the Supreme Court decided that a state law was unconstitutional. So the way that a case gets to the Supreme Court is you sue someone, sue the government. In this case, it was a suit brought against the state of Georgia. And that case made its way through the various different courts, whether then that was a state court and then appeal to the federal court and then to the federal circuit court and then on to the Supreme Court, right? There is a process to get there. But ultimately, when it ended up before the Supreme Court, John Marshall and the Marshall Court decided that the state law couldn't do that. The state law wasn't following the Constitution, and so therefore was unconstitutional. So Fletcher v. Peck is important. The specifics of the case itself are not important, but the specifics of the case itself, the important part is a state law was unconstitutional. It was the first time that the federal government rendered a decision on a state law. So it was a pretty significant case in that regard. And then the last really important case that was brought before the Marshall Court was McCulloch versus Maryland. Now here, the state of Maryland, this is in 1819, the state of Maryland tried to tax the Second National Bank of the United States, which was a federal bank that was located in the state of Maryland. Now the court ruled that a state cannot tax a federal institution, right? Because the federal government is supreme to state law. So that was unconstitutional. Maryland could not tax a federal institution, in this case, tax the national bank, because a federal institution is supreme over state law. So here you see three different cases where John Marshall has decided of the powers of the federal government, right? The Supreme Court has the power to review laws that are passed by Congress and actions of the president. The federal government, the Supreme Court in particular, has the power to review state law, and state law has to follow the spirit of the Constitution. And then here, a state cannot tax or do anything to harm a federal institution because federal law is supreme over state law. So again, really establishing the power here of the federal government. Now, lastly, we're going to start talking about American expansion. And again, we're going to talk about expansionism a little bit more as we go throughout this chapter, especially as we start to talk about manifest destiny. But here in particular, we're going to talk about what happens after the government purchases the Louisiana Territory, purchases the Louisiana Purchase from France. There's this effort to explore and see what's out there, right? So let's talk about how that happens and what that means. So, following the Louisiana Purchase, the US government wanted to have some sort of influence and control over North America. So, Thomas Jefferson persuades Congress, pressures them really, to fund
an expedition of this newly purchased territory, and that was at a cost of $2,500, which today the federal government could spend $2,500 in about a minute and a half, if not more, or if not shorter. But $2,500 was a big expense to send a couple guys to some territory and look around. So Jefferson pressures Congress to fund that expedition of the land, led by Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark, Lewis and Clark, right? And so what this expedition is going to provide the United States is really great scientific knowledge, really good geographic knowledge of the region. You know of Sacagawea, who helps Lewis and Clark explore these territories, gives them a greater knowledge of the region, stronger claims to the U.S., stronger claims to the Oregon Territory. We'll talk again about the Oregon Territory, which becomes part of a decision and an agreement between the U.S. and Britain later on in this chapter. And better relations with the American Indians who live here. And unfortunately, we don't maintain that relationship as we go. But you even get two grizzly bears, two grizzly cubs who are gifted to the White House, gifted to the president of the United States because of this expedition. So that shows you the kind of the relationship that had been built here. Unfortunately, it's not maintained throughout history. So let's take a look at some of the key takeaways from lesson 4.2 as we kind of wrap up this section on political parties in the era of Jefferson. So the things that are important for you to take away, right? In the early 1800s, you have national political parties that continue to debate issues that are very important to America. Tariffs, which are taxes on imports, the powers of the federal government, relations with European powers, particularly with Britain and France. That's the big takeaway from this section. The second big takeaway is the Supreme Court with John Marshall, the decisions that establish the role of the judiciary in determining kind of what the Constitution means, right? Establishing this principle of judicial review, establishing this principle of the supremacy or the precedence of federal law over state law. And then lastly, the important takeaway is how the US government wanted to have influence and control over North America after the Louisiana Purchase. And they do this through expedition, through exploration, through diplomatic efforts with the Native American tribes who live there. But those are the key takeaways. And then also when we think of vocabulary terms that are important to know, the fundamentally important ones to know about are Thomas Jefferson, the Louisiana Purchase, who John Marshall was, what Marbury versus Madison meant, and judicial review. Those five are very key terms to know. You could also know more about the Jeffersonian Republic, the Embargo Act, McCulloch versus Maryland, which establishes the supremacy of the federal government. But those are the important takeaways to know in this section. So that wraps up lesson 4.2, and we'll see you in the next one.